Welcome to Name Takes, a podcast about the cultures of naming, from the names of streets to buildings to people and beyond. What are the stories behind certain names? And what causes do specific names promote? Where can the roots of one name or other be found? Could these be invented? In Name Takes, we include artists' voices and cases from the art field. Because in art, meaning-making is central. And most of all, because art helps us formulate better questions about the present.
My name is Sofia Hernandez Choncuy, and I am pleased to introduce you to episode 10 of Name Takes, a podcast by Kunstinstituut Melly. On this episode, Mary Wang interviews Ken Liu. Both of them are creative writers, avid readers, and active thinkers. But the interview focuses specifically in the ways in which Ken Liu creates worlds, the reasons he has for inventing languages. Now, before we listen to Mary and Ken, I'd like to give a shout out to Kayam, the invented character and name behind the voice of the first 4 episodes of Name Takes. If you have not listened to them, please do.
Okay, so maybe we can start with an introduction. Could you tell me a bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I am Ken Liu. I am a futurist and a writer based just outside of Boston in the U.S. I work with governments and nonprofit organizations and think tanks around the world on topics like narrative futures and climate change and cryptocurrency and all sorts of ideas about how we can be better prepared for an uncertain and changing future. I also publish a great deal of speculative fiction, science fiction, and fantasy.
So to continue on to the fiction, let's talk about the Dandelion Dynasty series, and more specifically, the language within it. So could you introduce the series to me?
Sure. So the Dandelion Dynasty is what I call a soappunk epic fantasy. The term is of my own invention, and it's used to describe a very specific aesthetic. Mainly, the series tries to combine a great deal of fantastical traditions from around the world, including East Asia, the Pacific Islands, and Western epics that I grew up on. And the idea is to create a fantasy world where the technology vocabulary is very much derived from the traditions of East Asia. So there's a lot of reliance on natural materials such as bamboo and paper and bird feathers and animal power and so on and so forth. But the world building is focused on the idea of combining philosophical traditions from around the world rather than trying to be limited to one specific area. And it is overall an effort at reusing and reappropriating and reinventing traditions that I feel at home in. So, for example, the novel makes a big deal about the idea that innovation and invention are not exclusively aspects of modern Western societies, but in fact can be seen as integral to the traditions from all around the world. Likewise, a lot of ideas that are sometimes seen as somehow uniquely East Asian are cast as actually universal values and not limited to one culture or one place. So on the whole, I would say that the punk part of soappunk is far more important than the soap part.
Right. And you also invented a new language as the lingua franca of this world. Could you talk to me a bit more about that and also which different traditions you pulled from?
Right. So the fantasy land in which most of the action takes place is called Dara, which is an archipelago of islands, loosely based on the islands of East Asia, so near Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and so on. The islands, the inhabitants of the islands, are a very diverse group, and they speak their own local languages, which I call topolects. That's a term derived from Greek topos, meaning place, and lect, meaning language. So it's a language unique to a place. However, all of the inhabitants of Dara are unified by a grapholect, meaning they are unified in their culture by a written language that is not necessarily the same as their vernacular. This written language is called Classical Ano. And Classical Ano is interesting because it is modeled, it's a constructed language, obviously, but it is modeled by pulling aspects from Classical Chinese, Old Japanese, bits of Arabic, bits of Latin, bits of Classical Greek, and even Old English. I took different aspects of these languages that I'm familiar with in various degrees and combine them. And of course, as a grapholect, it's far more interesting in the way it is written versus the way it's spoken.
I was reading an essay by Ursula Le Guin about inventing fictional languages. And she wrote, most invented languages begin with invented names. At what point did naming come into this process? And what are you communicating with the names within this world?
So the way I think about names is slightly different. I'm very much influenced by the ideas of somebody like Walter Ong, who was an anthropologist who wrote extensively on the idea of literacy versus orality. There's a huge change in the way we perceive the world and craft our own ideas using language when we shifted from a primarily oral species to a primarily literate species. Again, there's a tendency in contemporary Western discourse to treat writing as merely an extension of speech and to view writing as subservient to speech. Somebody like Dara spoke of this extensively. But I want to try to push away from that idea. There is a fundamental difference in the way we relate to language and even in the way we use language between an oral society and a literate one. The very way we think of language as beautiful, the very way we think of a sentence as good, a well-tempered sentence changes when we go from being oral to being literate. And so when I was thinking about names for various things and places and people, I wanted to really push the idea that I'm talking about a grapholect here, a written language around which people rally. So this may be strange to folks who think of language as primarily a spoken thing. They care a lot about how it sounds. I don't. I care much more about the way a name is written than the way the name is said by somebody. So in Classical Ano, for example, the way something is written, its logogram representation is the primary form in which the name is embedded. People from different parts of Dara and even from outside of Dara may say that name differently, but as long as they believe fundamentally that the written form is reducible to that one logogram, then they're talking about the same thing. So to me, the names as embodying the logograms is primary. The way they're said can be very different. Different people will say it in different ways.
And why is it primary? What consequences does it have for either the story or even the reading experience?
I think what I wanted to do with that aspect of the world building is to highlight. So just one more thing. A lot of times people speak about speculative fiction as, fiction purely about the imagination. I don't. I think of speculative fiction as primarily a way of filtering the present reality in which I find myself and to see it in a different way. So when I emphasize the written form of a name and talk about the way all the different ways that people speak may be unified under one written language, under one grapholect, I'm really making a comment about the way we think about language in the contemporary world and the way we think about what does it mean for two people to speak the same language? What does it mean for a language to evolve into something else? What does it mean to have one script versus two? What does it mean to be multilingual? What does it mean to be able to even communicate? Because fundamentally, what I've discovered or convinced myself over time is that you actually will not be able to find any two individuals in the world who speak the same language. People think that they speak the same language, but they do not. The way that one person uses the word courage to mean something, when somebody says courage, what they mean by that is not merely what the dictionary says the word courage means. The person who says courage is pulling up behind that word a whole series of stories and memories and illusions and myth that are important to that person. And courage means all of those things added together. But a second person, even somebody who grew up in the same household, would not have the exact same set of stories, the same set of associations and illusions, much less two people from, opposite sides of the country or opposite sides of the globe who claim to speak the same language. It turns out every person is speaking an idiolect, a language unique to that person, idiosyncratic, suited to their own history, and uniquely able to represent that person's mental mindscape. And the fact that we manage to communicate with each other at all, to me, is miraculous. And we never really do successfully communicate 100%. We're always missing large swath of stories behind the words that someone else is using. But nonetheless, we try to point to some things and say that these are the things around which we rally. This is the written form of the language. The word courage, as written down on the page, is the word that we both think we mean. So even though we actually have very different ideas about what courage means, we can sort of agree on that written representation as the representation for these two entirely disparate sets of ideas. That's the kind of experience, the kind of idea that I wanted to convey in my world by making that explicit, by making my fantasy world one in which the written form of the word is primary and everyone else recognizes that that's the case and that they can only communicate by means of resorting to these bedrock representations that we can all sort of agree on, but knowing all the time that true communication is practically impossible. And in fact, in my novel, there's a lot of yearning for the ability of to communicate effectively. People who speak different languages end up using the same set of logograms to communicate, but they know that they're not really communicating soul to soul. And when you actually find someone who is able to match you, whose set of stories matches yours so exact that the two of you can stare at the same logogram and be able to have the same mental experience so that you're telepathically connected and fully in empathy. That kind of experience is the ultimate in love and ability to find a sympathetic, vibrating soul. In the novel, I describe that as finding the mirror of your soul. And that is the idea. It's the idea that the two of you are so in tune, that you're in sync, that your ideolects are able to latch onto the same set of logograms and truly vibrate together. And that is an experience that in real life we yearn for, and it's very hard for us to find.
Now that you've completed the entire series, which has turned out to be 4 books, are there still questions around language or naming that you have not yet explored?
Oh, of course. I don't think these are questions that anybody can ever work through in one lifetime. One lifetime is way too short. I'm sure that if we outlive for thousands of years, we would still have questions. Many of the questions that I struggle with and work through in the novel were questions that Plato and Zhuangzi and all sorts of philosophers throughout history have struggled with. And they, came up with their own answers, some of them more satisfying than others. But I think part of the process of being human is to struggle with these questions yourself and to come up with your own answers. And they may be just like your idiolect, unique to you and suitable to you and to no one else. But that's part of what being human is all about. It's to invent your own language. This is a thing that I said in other contexts. I said that, to be a great writer, you have to give up the idea that you're going to learn to write in something called modern standard English or good prose, whatever that means. When you're learning to write professionally, a lot of times you think that the secret is to learn to craft things in a way that is considered good, quote unquote. But that's actually a very misleading idea. I would say that to be a great writer or a great artist, what you really need to do is to ultimately invent your own language that does not exist before and has never existed before. And you must use that language to tell the story that only you can tell. So somebody like Herman Melville did not write in something called 19th century English. Dickens also did not write in something called 19th century English. They became such great writers that the unique language they invented became identified as the language of the age. But no, these are languages invented uniquely by them to tell their own story. And if you read through them, their voice comes through absolutely clearly. No one else writes like them. They invented their own language, their own set of words, grammatical forms, their own errors, mistakes, patterns. And it's only when you successfully invent something like that for yourself that you can truly call yourself someone who can tell the story you wanted to tell. Because if if you couch your story in the form of a language that is not unique to you, then what you're really doing essentially is string together a bunch of cliches. So this is, the other thing that's kind of interesting. The more accessible your work is and your language is and your words are, the more cliche written it is. The only reason something is accessible and easy to understand is because it's a cliche. But if you get away from that and become as idiosyncratic and as you as possible, then necessarily it will require effort and require investment on the part of the readers to understand what it is you're doing. But that is the only way by which you can truly invent a new language to tell the story that only you can tell.
You write short stories as well. You've written many other things aside from the Dandelion Dynasty. And what about the naming within those stories?
So in every story, I've had to invent essentially new ways of naming. I think every story I've written, with a few exceptions, takes place in an entirely new world. And so that requires me to come up with a new set of names and a new set of relationships between people and names. People in different fictional worlds have to name the world and partition the semantic space into different bits and pieces. When I approach a new story, I'm sort of, in some ways, recreating the process by which Adam comes to name everything in the world in Paradise Lost. So in that great poem, there's this wonderful scene of Adam gaining consciousness for the first time and having to name everything in the world. Naming is a way of not actually so much assigning names to objects that exist already, which is a very objectivist kind of view of the world, but rather naming is the way you partition the world into comprehensible bits. The way you decide something is worth naming is inherently an act of interpretation, of command, of making sense. And what you decide to name and what you decide to leave unnamed says a lot, perhaps as much, if not more, than just the actual names being given. And I always have a lot of fun working through short stories and thinking about what things ought to be named and what things ought to remain nameless. What are the words that don't exist in our world, and why are these words important? And what words we take for granted don't exist in this world? And if that is the case, what does that mean? It's a lot of fun to work through fiction in this way. To me, it feels like writing fiction is a really great way for me to think through and interrogate and figure out how I really think and how I really understand the world as it is.
You mentioned at the start of the conversation that you're also a futurist. And I'm wondering how language and perhaps also naming comes into play in your explorations of the future.
So as a futurist, one of my deep concerns is our excessive focus on certain kinds of technologies and our neglect of other technologies. We seem to think that the technologies that matter the most are machines. They are algorithms, machines, things that require a great deal of engineering and that are seen as technology when we use the term. But just as important, in my view, for the future are technologies of the narrative type, of the human type. What I mean is the story that a society tells itself about who they are and how they're different from every other society across time and space is also a form of technology. It's a human-made thing. It's a thing that we have to craft, that we have to learn, that we have to improve, we have to modify over time. So the story of a society, the story of a people, that is also a super important piece of technology, but we don't really pay nearly enough attention to it. Similarly, the way we make decisions together, what I call the technology of collective decision-making. So things like courts, juries, legislatures, political parties. All of these things are also forms of technology. When we obsess over things like voting machines, but don't obsess nearly as much over what does it mean to have a political party? What does it mean to join a political party? What does it mean to call yourself a citizen? What does it mean to participate in a jury? These are technologies that to me are far more important. In fact, I would say a constitution is not really a document, but a set of stories and practices of collective decision-making that together allow a people to claim a sense of distinction and a sense of being different, of coherence, of having a future that they can strive towards at all. It is having the right story that to me matters a lot more than having the right institutions or the right quote-unquote technologies. Because when you have the right story, any failure in the institutions or in the physical technologies you have can be routed around and fixed. But if you don't have the right story or the right set of collective decision-making technologies, then the best hardware, the best infrastructure, the best, most powerful computers and spaceships and guns and destroyers and submarines and missiles are not going to help you. It is far more important to get the story right than to get the physical hardware. So as a futurist, my emphasis is to explain to people that we don't pay nearly enough attention to these other aspects. And in order to build a better future, a more hopeful future, we really have to pay a lot of attention to the stories we tell ourselves, and to figure out that a lot of constitutional and political crises are really crises of storytelling. And that has to be where you start, not where you just pay some lip service to at the end. Unless you fix the story, nothing else matters.
And I guess we're seeing in real time how naming is at the forefront of that, as we see countries renaming the streets of Russian embassies into Freedom Square, as we see the Canadians renaming their Putin dish. I'm not sure whether this is the correct pronunciation, but you get the gist of what I'm referring to.
That's right. That's right. I mean, there's a huge amount of effort, but I also want to caution that a little bit, because I think sometimes people can get into the trap of thinking that names are magical, that if you just name an injustice away, somehow the injustice actually has been removed. And so the most extreme version of this is people who think that it matters more to use quote-unquote politically correct speech than to actually focus on the consequences of systemic racism. This is, an extreme version, but there are some people who think that by speaking, by using the right words, by somehow not using certain words and using other words, you have magically fixed the problem. Names are not magic. You cannot just name problems away. You can use the most proper language, quote unquote, whatever that means, and still do absolutely nothing to fix the consequences and the ills of systemic racism. Fixing an actual problem is much harder than just coming up with a new name. The name can be sometimes nothing more than just the start, or even less than a start. The real hard work has to be done over generations. These are not things that can be fixed overnight.
I would like to close this conversation by asking you about your name. What can you tell me about your name?
Not a whole lot. Like most people, the name that I use is picked for me by my parents, so I have no say in it. I will say that I'm actually much more attached to my username, as most people are. So almost on all social media platforms, I go by KYLIU99. So KYLIU, of course, is just the initials plus my last name. But the 99 part is really cool. I always like the fact that 99 is the biggest number under 100. It's the biggest two-digit number. And, you can sort of claim that's egomania or whatever, but I love the fact that I can put those numbers behind my name, and it's my favorite number. It's as grand as you can go without going to 3 digits, and there's something deeply satisfying about it. It's a large number, but it's symmetrical, it's mystical, and I just like the way it looks.
And very fortunate, according to some Chinese people.
I guess so, yeah. I never thought of it that way, but I like the fact that it just looks so cool to me. And I can always sort of, when I'm sort of picking a username or something, I have very little chance of clashing with someone, because just by adding the two numbers, it almost makes it certain that I'm not going to clash with other people.
Okay. Well, that is a good naming tip that I will take from this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you for listening. Name Takes is a podcast produced by Kunstinstituut Melly in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. Sarah de Meuze and Mary Wang conducted the artist interviews in episodes 5 to 10 of Name Takes. Each of these episodes is introduced by Sofia Hernandez Choncuy. Judith Scholz is the voice talent of the original music. The podcast sound, mixing and original music, has been developed by Jan Pol at Okapi Recordings in Rotterdam. The audio files were mastered by Masterenzo Mastering. Production management was overseen by Wendy van Slagmaat-Bos and communication and marketing by Jeroen Laven. The graphic design of Name Takes is by Wooseok Yang from Orange Slice Type, who participated in CLIP, an arts education program of Kunstinstituut Melly. This episode was realized thanks to a grant from the Prins Bernhard Fund. Name Takes has also been realized thanks to a grant from a donor who wishes to remain unnamed. Kunstinstituut Melly thanks them for their support and also gives special thanks to the participating artists for sharing their experiences, projects and insights to listeners of Name Takes.